Great news. Okay, got it working. I'm just gonna paste it and let you know when we're live on the 20th time was a charm, apparently.
Paul, are you speaking more about the harassment policy? And I know the code of ethics will be fairly brief, but is that the intent?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Will you be talking about the harassment policy?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Okay,
We have a couple other people joining as well, but I can speak to it.
okay.
Okay, it's in board docs. We are good to go.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the policy committee meeting. My name is Ruth Fortune. I am the chair of the committee. We have a few items on our agenda today, so without any further delay, we'll jump right into it. The first item is the second reading of the pets in classrooms / schools policy. Deputy Foster, do you want to discuss this as well?
I'm happy to, sure. And Christina, are you able to put it up on the screen?
Yes, actually, can you share or no? If you have it up.
I don't have it up, but I can pull it up really quick.
Okay, hold on.
I have it up, but it's
Yes.
not, I don't think it's in a very, I have the red line. So do you want me to share it, Christina? Is that easier for you?
Yes, please, just this first policy, and then I'll screen share the rest of the
I
meeting.
can share as well if you want. I've got it up.
Okay.
What would you prefer?
If you just for this policy, I want to make sure so a few people have the YouTube link. That's what I'm trying to email. Sorry.
Go ahead, Deputy Foster. You're welcome to share.
Can you see my screen okay? So this is the, I believe, second reading. And so we got feedback at the last committee meeting around some potential updates. And so you still see this is the red line. And I think the largest changes from the first reading, there's two that I'll highlight. One is adding a sentence here in the first paragraph. So primarily, right, the impetus for this policy was around, animals in classrooms relative to instruction. But I think as we were contemplating it, since it does say live animals in the classroom, we just wanted to add a sentence relative to the potential for support animals that could be relevant to a staff member or a student. And so we wanted the same kind of concept that you see in the rest of the policy around notification to families if there's going to be an animal in the classroom. Seems like that should apply in both cases. And obviously this speaks to accommodation for a qualifying disability. So that was one change from the last time we shared the policy with you. And then further down, I think the first version of the policy we shared, we had some concern about when families are asked or given the opportunity to take a classroom pet home for a weekend or a school break. And in the original version of the policy, we were saying that they can't do that. And obviously we got lots of feedback from the board, which made sense that, that can be a good thing. And so what we noted, the changes here continues to say there's a plan for care and containment, including care over weekends, holidays, and school breaks. Classroom teacher may at their discretion provide care over weekends, holidays, and school breaks. In addition, they may identify the family of a student to provide care with prior written consent of the student's parent or guardian and the school principal. So I think there was some input from the board that the classroom teacher would want to be part of deciding what family would take the animal home. We want to make sure there's written consent so that, the family is very clear on what they're signing up for. And then the last addition here, the school will ensure the teacher or family who are caring for the animal are provided with the necessary supplies for the animal's care. And then this was in the first reading, but just to highlight again, just the importance of if there's going to be an animal in the classroom, making sure everyone is aware and also making sure there's any visibility into potential allergy issues for students in that classroom. So that's really, so for the most part, the big changes are adding the sentence around support animals and adding some additional language to be clear that it's fine for families to provide care for a classroom pet, but want to make sure we're clear about how that should happen in terms of both consent and providing for the necessary supplies.
Thank you, Deputy Foster. Do we have any questions from anyone?
Hey, Ruth, can I just say one thing?
Sure, of course.
Sure. So the last sentence that we have with respect to animals cannot be introduced into a classroom if the student served in that classroom has a documented allergy to the animal. I'm not sure we want to include that only because I'm looking at it from an accommodation perspective. So if we're talking about a service animal that perhaps a staff member needs, if a student has an allergy, I think we would have to at least assess whether some accommodation could be made for that student. We might not be able to, right? It might be a situation where there's no reasonable accommodation that could be made and the animal cannot be introduced into the room. But just with respect to the ADA, I just would be concerned with having a fast rule like that, because I think we at least have to have an assessment around whether there's some reasonable way that we can accommodate the student now and allow the service animal to be in the classroom. There might not be any way, but I think we at least still have to have that conversation. It's kind of like having a rule under the ADA, like we don't want to have a rule saying, you know, if someone exhausts all of their time, right, and now they're asking for more time to recover from an injury, we don't want to have a rule saying, you know, if you need more than a month of time, we're not going to be able to accommodate that. We have to just assess every situation. So I just might stay away from a, you know, a hard and fast rule like is contained in the last sentence there. Does that make sense?
I think it does. So you're not taking issue, however, with the word documented. Like, does the allergy actually has to be documented? Is that too much of a barrier too? Or do we take that child at his or her word that there's an allergy?
No, I think we can ask for documentation. It's just the fact that we can't have a rule saying if someone has a known documented allergy, in every case, we're not going to allow that animal to be in the classroom.
Okay. So you don't want that bright line rule, just more flexibility. Okay.
If I may, the only thing, we can try to add we can think about, Lori, how to adjust the language.
Yeah.
I think what we were thinking, because we did talk about that, and I think we were thinking because we had this up here about the qualifying disability, that where we would, as an accommodation, I mean, we'd have to think about, like, we have an obligation if somebody has a support animal to try to meet that accommodation.
Right.
And so I think we were thinking we'd have to meet that by who are the students in that person's classroom if it's a staff member, or who are the other students in that student's classroom if it's a student. Although I hear you on, you know, not all allergies are created equal, so maybe there's a way for a student to remain in a classroom with an animal to which they're allergic, but I'm not sure how to say that, but we could take that offline to try to.
I see what you're saying. I see why you put that in there. I was reading it to say, like, if a student has an allergy, it doesn't matter if the person who needs the animal in that classroom, we just can't do it. So like there was some other schools, like I just Googled, like Hamden had some language like, you know, students and teachers with allergies must receive special consideration before animals are brought into school, or like something like maybe just it has to be tweaked a little so that it doesn't seem like we're making a hard and fast rule. No, but I get to your point. You weren't thinking that when you put that language in there. You were just thinking that, you know, we don't want to, you know, not accommodate someone, right? And in a situation where a teacher might need the service animal, we just have to figure out what to do with the students who potentially might have an allergy.
I like that language, Lori. I just made a change to the sentence. Does it read better now?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yep. Yep. I like that.
All right. Board Member Brody?
I'm just making sure that we are saying, I think it was cleared up for me, but I'm hoping that we are saying that the student has priority over the service animal.
We're talking about the student with the allergy, Board Member Brody?
Yes. Or whatever, if the student So is it just an allergy, or it could be a student that's just deathly afraid of a dog or something?
I mean, as currently written, it only speaks to an allergy. It doesn't speak to like being afraid of the animal. And in terms of, I don't know that we're preferencing one or the other. I think that we do, and Lori can probably speak to this better than I can, but we do have an obligation if somebody has a support animal to attempt to provide an accommodation. That's not at the expense of the student, but we have to attempt. But I do think the language as just revised does make sure we're paying attention to the needs of a student or staff member with an allergy.
I'm just wondering about at to what degree, if the student, for whatever reason, is not working out, whether it's an allergy, whether it's a fear, whether it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I think these are always really fact specific. It's hard to generalize. Certainly when you're, in an accommodation world, it's very fact specific based on each circumstance. So I think to Deputy Foster's point, that language is acknowledging that we absolutely have to make those considerations in all cases, and we're acknowledging that.
Thank you. Board Member Walker?
Yeah, and listening to Board Member Brody's concern, I'm wondering if the language that we're speaking of around that special consideration and or accommodation can be expanded beyond documented allergy to maybe documented allergy and other, documented concern. I'm thinking that Board Member Brody was just trying to see what language could we insert that would say we would give consideration to other student needs, as long as I would say it needs to be documented because, um, yeah, yeah, I would say it that way. But yeah, that's it. That's my comment.
Thank you. Board Member Wilson?
Sorry, I was on mute. So when you say we have to make every effort to accommodate a service animal, is there anything that the child or that needs a service animal or teacher or whatever it is there anything that they need to do um, to ensure that that dog is safe enough to be in a classroom?
Lori, I don't know. I mean,
I
I
think
don't
we
know
can. I think we
about
definitely.
service animals, but
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
The district, I think, certainly can ask questions and attempt to obtain documentation or confirmation that the animal has temperament training, has been trained, right, has gone through what the animal would need to go through to be a service animal, and so that's would be all part of, I think, the conversation and the interactive process when you're talking about whether we can make an accommodation, any sort of accommodation. And in this particular scenario, it would be, a student or a staff member indicating that because of a medical condition or disability, they need to have a service animal with them.
Thank you. It's just for my education. Thank you.
Lori, correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, I didn't mean to take the policy down. Under ADA, there are circumstances under which we can say that we are not able to make an accommodation.
So the assessment is around whether we can make a reasonable accommodation, right? So that's always, and there may be scenarios where what the individual is asking for various reasons, we can't do that. And so there might be other things that we can explore. And so that's the biggest, big piece around the ADA, ensuring that we're at least engaging in that interactive process to determine whether we can make some sort of reasonable accommodation, which might not be exactly what the person is requesting.
Right, so this policy doesn't necessarily mean that anybody who has a service animal by definition has to be allowed to bring it to school.
No, I think it's acknowledging that, what this is, when this situation arises, we're gonna make take our legal obligations and do what we need to do to have that conversation and make the appropriate assessment.
Thank you for the discussion on this. I don't see any other hands raised, and I believe the revision that Deputy Foster made by adding special consideration and or accommodation of students or staff served address that revision addresses the concerns that have been brought up. So we will proceed to the next item on our agenda, which is the Code of Ethics. I'm sorry, I've skipped. The next item is the harassment policy. Again, we have a red line that I'm happy to share, or if Deputy Foster, if you want to pull that up and share, or Cristina, whichever one of us.
I am back.
Perfect.
Yeah, I could start, but we do have Aaron Wilson here who spent a lot of time working on this policy from our legal department. And I'll just preview that this policy, we're bringing it to you largely because, I think you all know that CABE did a review of our policies, and we've just been working through them to make sure all of our policies have the most current possible language. And so there was no particular triggering event in terms of why we're reviewing this possible policy at this moment, other than CABE saying, hey, this is a policy you may want to take a look at. And I also want to make an important clarification, because you're going to see this cross out in the first paragraph where it talks about harassment related to a bunch of protected classes. I want to emphasize this is our harassment policy relative to staff. So we have a separate policy relative to students. So this is about staff conduct. We also have a separate policy that's our anti-discrimination policy. So the reason you see that cross out in the first paragraph is our harassment policy applies across the board to behavior of all staff towards all other staff, regardless of particular protected classes. So that was certainly legacy language in the harassment policy, but I want to emphasize we absolutely still have an anti-discrimination policy that includes the identification of protected classes relative to discrimination. So particularly for the viewing public, if they see us crossing that out, that's really because this is a harassment policy and it applies to anyone from any group in their engagement of behavior towards anyone from any other group. So I may have explained that ineloquently. But as we go through this, there's a lot here. And Aaron, I don't know if you want to kind of talk through sort of the bigger changes. And again, we took a lot of language from the CABE model policy, as you see in the comments.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so as Paul stated, you will see the biggest change is the definition. We really had to change the definition. It was problematic that the definition of harassment essentially had to be based on a protected class, because we know that there has been harassment in the district that was what we would sort of generally think of as harassing behavior, but it wasn't based on a protected class. So does that mean it doesn't fit our definition when we knew it did? And so, as Paul said, in the introductory paragraph, we added we took out the references to protected classes and then added language. It's what's in the pink highlight there, and that comment on the side from the CABE model policy. So that language was just taken from the model policy. And then if you want to scroll down a little under definitions, we crossed out the whole definition because the whole thing, if you read through what has been crossed off, it's discriminatory behavior on the basis of, and there's a lot of classes. And so we took that out, and instead and instead put in our own definition, there is a line there, no form of harassment will be tolerated in the Hartford Public Schools. I want to be clear, we didn't remove that, we just moved it up to the first paragraph, so it's just included in the first paragraph now. And then you'll see new language there, starting with, for the purposes of this policy, that's the new definition. And then if you continue scrolling, then in this paragraph, we just made some small changes. We did add harassment and or bullying, not to be confused with, I understand we have, lots of language around bullying for students. And so, I wanted to be clear, this is staff conduct. So that's why it says right up at the top, like it's in our 4000 series, it says staff conduct at the top. And we did also add, you can see that that Hartford Public Schools will discipline any individual who retaliates against any person who, we added, files a harassment complaint or does these other things that participates in the investigation. So a lot of those changes are minor. The biggest change, obviously, is just in the definition.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wilson, do we have any questions from anyone in the meeting? Perfect. Don't see any hands up. You were very thorough. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, which is the Code of Ethics. This is a fairly short change that simply says that Hartford Public Schools will follow the City of Hartford's Code of Ethics, which we have been doing, as I understand, but now we are explicitly stating so. I will pass it on to Deputy Foster or Ms. Wilson if anyone has any additional comments.
I'll just add that this was another one that CABE flagged, that we didn't name our code of ethics in our policy, but we also didn't want to try to reinvent the wheel, knowing that we are subject to the code of ethics that's adopted by the city. So that's why the policy is a very brief just statement that Hartford Board of Education and Hartford Public Schools follow the city's code of ethics. But that was just, again, coming from CABE in their audit, flagging that we didn't have a policy that stated what our code of ethics was.
Perfect. Any questions on the Code of Ethics? Wonderful. Moving on to the first reading of the naming of facilities or parts of facilities policy. Cristina, if you want to pull that up, or I can pull it up as well. Looks like you're pulling it up.
I am, but of course it's great. Let me just let me try one more time to click on. There we go.
Here we go. So we discussed this last time. I did not make any revisions following our last meeting about this policy. I do still have a few things. If anyone has any comments on additional evidence we would want from someone who's requesting that a school be renamed, we're open to ideas we can include to the list. As you see in 4C, I will mention that's not an inclusive list. It's just examples of things that people could provide, but they're not only limited to these items. We also did add a policy, the final bullet point, Cristina, if you'd scroll down, as per Ed Wilson's comment, to allow, I think it's just the pagination is strange. If you just scroll down further. Yes, that the board has, it's the next one, number 8, further down. Okay, maybe that's it. Sorry.
Is there a number 8 on yours? Maybe I have an older one. I thought this was the one you sent. I apologize.
No, let me pull up what. Let me just pull it up from my system. Bear with me 1 second. It's possible that it's the number. I remember it being the last one, but so the point that we added essentially is that the board reserves the discretion to change the name of any school named after an individual should we find that to be warranted. And it's intentionally vague so that we can exercise its discretion on a case-by-case basis should it arise. So that's the change. I will try to pull up my document internally and show it. Any other questions on the school naming policy? We did have some discussion about whether or not someone should be alive or deceased for a school to be named after them. We did not quite reach a consensus, but the revision as it is does not require that someone be deceased in order for a school to be renamed after that individual. I just want to open it up to see if there's any further comments or questions. I know Board Chair Hockenhall, you had some questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Fortune. Yeah, my question or my comment, I guess, is around where I think there's added language around a donation to the school would be a consideration. It concerns me a little bit that we're saying that because I don't think at the end of the day we would actually make a decision around whether or not they gave us a donation, right? Like if somebody didn't do a lot, but they wanted to give us a donation, I don't necessarily think we want to do a naming rights type of a thing on a school. Not to say we should encourage people to, to donate if they want, but I feel like since it's not something that we would be giving, an extra, gold star to someone because they did that then they would be named the school. So that's my feedback on the policy. I think everything else on it looks great to me.
Does anyone else have any thoughts or opinions on what Board Chair Hockenhall shared? So I added that I believe at some point when we had a discussion about this policy, one of the board members brought up whether or not there would be a donation when someone is seeking to have a school named after an individual. Not that it's required or expected. So I added in the policy just as an invitation to anyone who would apply for a renaming application, just to put it out there that that's something they could consider. I personally am more in favor of keeping it, although I'm open to revising the language. But that's sort of how it made it into the revised version. Board Member Walker?
I share Chair Hockenhall's concern as I was reading the language. I share her concern and don't see why it needs to be part of the naming policy. That there may be some way to clarify it or to have this language put into another type of policy. Like, I certainly would encourage people to give and contribute to the university, not university, I'm sorry, to the school district. And I'd be open to some language that says, if there's some, very defined and specific cost, related to, naming, that maybe the petitioner would be agreeable to cover, some very defined and specific costs that, that otherwise aren't covered. The way it reads, it does give the impression that someone who donates a large sum of money would somehow have an inside track to having something named, or to you get the point. It's more of a clarification thing to me.
Board Member Wilson?
So I'm not sure what Tyrone, I'm not sure if I heard exactly what your concern was. I don't think I think at least like how I read it, I thought it was a part of the criteria. You still have to meet some of the other criteria before we even get to the donation. But I think in any case, buildings being renamed in the school system or of any kind, donations are sometimes involved in that process. So as a part of it, yes, I don't have any issue with it. I'm not sure if I understood what your concern was particularly. If someone who is a part of the community or from the community or has ties to the community wants to donate um a large sum of money to a particular school, and as part of that, the school or an auditorium or something like that is renamed after them. I don't really see the issue with that, so maybe you can help me better understand.
Um, yeah, Woman Wilson, I believe um, Chair Harkenhall brought up the concept of naming rights, and so in the concept of what you're saying, if someone contributed $500,000 to some school building, then potentially, if that money was used for the science lab, then potentially the science lab could have that person's name placed on it if they requested it. If that's what we're desiring, that's fine. The clarification she was asking is that our intent? Is our intent to create an environment where people, in essence, have naming rights, right? That was really kind of the question. You seem to be saying you may be okay with the idea of naming rights, right? If you contribute $1 million to help redo the auditorium, maybe the auditorium can have your name on it, if requested, of course, by that person. Is that what you're saying?
Board Chair Hockenhall, do you want to clarify your question?
Yeah, I'm definitely not opposed to that, but
Okay.
that might be a different conversation.
I see you have your hands up.
Yeah, I was just curious, and I don't know if Lori, if you know the answer to this, but have any of the other schools that have been named after people in Hartford, have they given donations? Like, is this something that has happened in the past that we want to continue that and just codify it, or is it not something that's happened in the past?
I don't know that that's happened in the past.
We're getting an echo from you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is everyone muted?
Yeah. Yes. Laura, you can try again.
Is that any better?
Do you have two devices on, like a phone or your?
I'm happy to jump in and sort of offer some thoughts on this. So the policy, I have it up. I think we can all see it. As it reads, right, there is no obligation for anyone to make a donation. It says so the application must show benefits to the school and the community, for example, a donation, right, or plans to fundraise for the school. So there's no obligation to actually make a donation or any type of monetary contribution. It's just an option that someone has. And it's really not a naming right. A naming right traditionally would mean you're giving money in exchange for changing a name on your behalf, and you have a right to that. We are specifically saying in that bullet 8 here, Cristina, that I think was missing in the prior version that you emailed, that the board shall have the sole discretion to change the name of a school or any part thereof after it's been named after an individual. So that's, clearly saying you give money. It doesn't mean you have the right for that school to remain named after you, or that it's in exchange for the naming. It's just an option. And ultimately, it's up to the board whether or not we do rename the school. And it's up to the board whether or not in the future we change the name of that school. So I think this is different than naming rights in the traditional sense, like you see with, say, a branch in a hospital or some university buildings. This is very different. But I'd also go a step further and say if somebody came to Hartford Public Schools with our vacancy and paying teachers less, and they want to offer us a large sum of money for renaming, I think that's a conversation I would be willing to entertain and see if it's worthwhile. But as it is in the policy, I personally don't see any conflict with that, nor is it an obligation or a demand that we're making for anyone who's applying to have a school renamed after an individual.
You're on mute. What the last part?
I muted myself. Are you able to speak now, Lori, or?
Is it any better when I'm not on the video?
No.
Feel free to send a chat and I can read it off if it's helpful. It wasn't the case earlier when you spoke, so I'm not sure what happened between then and now. Another comment that was brought up was also saying over a long period of time, that person after whom we're naming a school must have been involved over a long period of time. And I think Chair Hockenhall said, well, what's a long period of time? So we've revised it to say a minimum of 20 years, you know, relatively arbitrary, that number. Happy to revise it to any number that we can agree upon. But 20 years currently is the number that we have instead of the vague over a long period of time. We also did add that we should request a background check on any individual after whom we want to rename a school. And that was, again, something that was brought up by fellow board members, and I've since added to the policy. Couple of hands have gone up again. Board member Walker first, and then board member Hockenhall.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. I would actually say that I would support the use of the substantial amount of time without particularly needing to define it. I don't think that in the policy I don't see this being a requirement. I think per your paragraph 8, because the board has the discretion to determine the naming piece, it can be left to the discretion of the board to me whether a substantial amount of time has been achieved. Like in the case of Mr. LaFontaine, right? His petition is that, you know, he was a superintendent for 12 years and then had some additional engagement with the district and community after his time as superintendent. But it may not necessarily be exactly 20 years. So I wouldn't want to have someone hamstrung because they didn't quite meet exactly 20 years. So that's all. I would just advocate that. So in this case, the flexibility can be given to the board, and we don't necessarily have to have a defined number.
Thank you. Board Chair Hockenhall.
Yeah, thanks. So along the lines of the 20 years, I was, I don't know what the number should be either, but I was gonna say maybe if it's, you know, with Hartford Public Schools and or the city of Hartford, to make it a little bit broader. I don't know this, right? But I don't know if Mayor Milner was involved in the school directly or if we named it after him because he was the mayor, but he was, you know, a significant figure within Hartford. So I'm not sure if we wanted to make it a little broader there as well. But I'm not, you know, 20 years, I could take or leave the 20 years, but if we made the service a little bit broader, that might take care of that as well.
Okay, it currently says with education in general or within Hartford Public Schools. Are we saying we want to expand it so that's not simply with education, but it's within the city of Hartford or within Hartford Public Schools? I don't feel strongly one way or another. Happy to revise if there's some consensus. So I could say, so we want to not have I'm in favor of not having a specific number of years personally. I think flexibility in this situation is warranted. Okay. Okay, so it's back to a long period of time, not a specific number of years. Okay, Board Member Walker?
Thank you. I would broaden it beyond education. The examples I'm thinking about when I was younger. After the Challenger accident, there were a number of Ron McNair named schools or um, um, Sally Ride or other because these people were notable figures in their hometowns, and so um, the hometown felt the need to honor these people and their contribution to the community. So, and in some ways, I do think expanding beyond education to somehow bring in significant impact because there are schools clearly named after people because of their significant impact. Um, and it wasn't necessarily because they were educated, but they made a significant impact to the community in which they lived.
Okay, significant long period of time within the community or with Hartford Public Schools in particular? Okay. Any other comments on this policy? Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the hope now is to move this along, bring it for first reading at our next board meeting in February.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Okay, I will send you that revision that I made, Christina, so we can recirculate. And with that final item 8 as well, we have the discretion to rename a school for any reason.
Thank you. And then I will repost and resend to the board as well. Thank you.
Yeah, this is like the 4th version, so I've just been a few versions of this going around. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is discussion on Title IX. And I will pass it over to Deputy Foster. I know at the pre-committee check-in, we had some discussions about how this possibly will be changing again. So I will pass it over to you.
Yeah, and I have Joanne Tremblay-Jackson, Peter Bergenholzer here. If there are specific questions, I can give the high level again, which is things people may know that the policy we very recently passed in the fall that took effect August 1, I think August 1 of last year, was put forward by the Biden administration that a court in January blocked that policy or that regulation, I should say, and ultimately the Department of Education then sent out guidance saying go back to the old one. It doesn't require a policy change on the part of the board because you may recall when we adopted the changes, we had to keep both policies simultaneously because the previous policy applied to activity or allegations of incidents that occurred previous to August 1, 24. The new policy applied to circumstances happening August 1 forward. And now we still have to maintain both policies because one will apply previous to August 1 and anything after Joanne and Peter can give us a specific date, a date in January. But for that intervening period from August 1 until early January, the new policy is still the governing document for any Title IX investigations that happen relative to activity that happened between August 1 and that date in January. We received I think it's a Dear Colleague letter from the Department of
It's
Education.
January 9th, but correct. And then it was Kentucky that originally had the litigation and that vacated it. But then the Office of Civil Rights sent out, excuse me, documentation stating that it was indeed vacated across the nation. And so did the U.S. Department of Education sent out that notice as well. So we're back to using the 2020. But I know some board members were also concerned about our non-discrimination policy and its revisions and whether we would stand behind that. And that continues to be indeed the changes because of state of Connecticut law that protects gender identity. So we're still okay with the changes that we made to the non-discrimination policies.
We just wanted it on the agenda tonight. So you were aware of the change that we have to go back to the previous policy, even though it doesn't require a vote for us to go back. We just wanted to make sure
Right.
you were aware of the change.
Thank you. Any questions or comments on this? Wonderful. Moving on to the final item on our agenda, the honorary diploma request that we've received, and Cristina will just debrief us on that.
Yes, as you know, the board did adopt or revise the policy to expand not just members of the military, but community members as well to be able to receive an honorary diploma. And we did receive an application. As you know, there were a few articles from Mr. Mike Fothergill, and then immediately the board, we had 5 new board members, so we wanted to give the new board members time to settle in. And now I will be circulating that application to the full board for review. And assuming all goes well by the next policy committee, we should have an answer.
Wonderful. So you can expect that email in your inbox. Any questions on that? Anyone? No. Wonderful. The final comment I have before we wrap up is related to the Teacher Advisory Committee. As I understand it, the Teaching and Learning Committee will now pass off that proposal to this committee. So we'll be discussing this in the Policy Committee, as it would be a policy change as to whether or not we want to create this new Teacher Advisory Board. Mr. Walker, did you want to add anything? I know you're one of the board members leading the charge on this one.
Yes, I will say I know we've had discussion about this to introduce the concept, and while I circulated that I'm going to call it the white paper from Richard and others, I think we kind of hit a little bit of an impasse because that document is almost like a white paper, almost like a reference. It's not something you can actually put into any kind of policy. But based on the conversation we had at the last meeting, I've talked to Jen over the weekend, and what I'm proposing structurally is to create a simplified type of write-up that can be addressed and acted on. And so what I wanted to propose around this HTAC was a kind of two-prong standard, right? One is talking about the group and how that group will be rolled out. And what I thought is workable is having the group speak to us in like a workshop format where we can get the benefit of really engaging teachers or a group of teachers on a range of topics. And that what I envision doing is sharing right now we have a workshop monthly. And so what I was going to propose is having a circumstance where every other month we would have an opportunity to hear from teachers. Like right now, we hear from the district leadership every month on the workshop meeting, and as opposed to creating a new meeting, just splitting off and having on an every other month basis the opportunity to hear from this advisory group on topics of interest that they would share and educate us about or share their experience about particular topics. The other prong is speaking about how to actually, the process to actually form the advisory group in terms of, how we elect and create an advisory group. And so structurally, the proposal was using like HFT or somebody that engages teachers to create and kind of vet some, group of teachers who would be interested based on some type of I want to call it job description, but some type of description of what we want as an advisory board. But to use HFT to collect up some set of candidates, and then at our board level, we come up with an approach to give some blessing to the group of folks that have been nominated, or if we had issues with one, we would voice that. That second piece, I'm going to structurally put together as a proposal, and I think as a group we would kind of nail that down. Don't want anything like we did for the board vacancy. That's way too much work and way too much energy on the board level. But come up with an approach where we can at least be made a prize to hear the people and have a way for us to look at like a cover letter and their statement of purpose, why they want to be on the board, and maybe look at their background, and to have us as a group kind of look at that level and express either some comfort or discomfort with certain candidates. And at that level, we could select, here are the folks that we think would be great members of this advisory board, and then kind of communicate that back. And then we work on some way to do some kind of orientation and timeline for how that would happen. But in terms of just moving forward, I wanted to simplify it to just having this advisory group work through kind of the workshop process, and then for us to focus on how to get this advisory group selected and moving forward. There was interest in having the advisory group work with committees, but I shared with Jennifer that I think that's a separate issue, because right now I think as a board, we need to determine how people can engage with our committees. And I think the reforming of the committee process, like, do we want people to be able to ask questions, or the level of participation we want for non-members, is separate from HTAC. That's us as a board deciding how we want people to be able to participate in the committee process. And I think that's a separate topic, so I don't want to get that wrapped around the axle here, right? And because right now, anyone can be invited to participate in the committee, to listen in and share at that level. And so that wouldn't change because you have HTAC. I think we need to decide, do we want people to be able to participate in other ways? And I'd rather that be a separate topic that we discuss. And based on what we determine about that, then any range of people, including HTAC, will be able to participate. So I'm suggesting taking that committee participation for right now kind of off the table until we figure out what we want to do there, and just have HTAC engage with us through like a workshop format. And if that seems agreeable, then I'm going to proceed to maybe talk to one or two of you other board members and get some feedback, and then write up some type of simplified kind of approach that we can look at kind of at a policy level, and then kind of address and discuss and like we did this evening, kind of line by line in a very simplified kind of one pager kind of document. That's kind of my framework. So if there's questions or comments, I'm willing to take them.
Thank you, Board Member Walker. invite us to reserve questions and comments when we're discussing this more fully in the next policy committee meeting, and give sufficient notice for people who have an interest to also show up and be able to answer our questions and offer comments. Does that sound agreeable to you, Board Member Walker?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Any other topics that I did not bring up or anyone believes should be raised? Okay, I think that's all for our meeting today.